Jeff Pearlman has written the book, New York Times bestselling author of 9 books, host of the Two Writers Slinging Yang podcast, Showtime, Magic, Kareem, Riley, and the Lakers dynasty of the 1980s, and now HBO making it into a series. Jeff, good morning. How surprised were you that you hear from how did you hear from somebody who decided that this would make for a great series?
So there's a guy named Jim Hecht, and he's a writer, and I only knew him because I looked at his IMDb page, and he was the writer of Ice Age: The Meltdown. That was his main credit, and he wanted to come to my house and sort of talk to me about the idea of turning this Laker book into he's like, I just think it could be something. And he shows up at our house. This is when we lived in New York, in New Rochelle, New York, and he shows up with a block of chocolate, a tomato, and a bottle of fake wine. Like that was his wooing material that he brought. I think he was at Grand Central and just needed to bring something. And he shows up at our house and he's like, I just really think this could be something good. And I don't know. And we're like, all right, yeah. Because if you do this long enough, you do get stuff optioned and it almost never becomes anything. I've had stuff optioned many times by now and it never becomes anything. And here's this guy, Ice Age: The Meltdown, Jim Hecht, and you think this is going to be nothing. And that was probably 7 years ago. And now I don't know how this happened. I swear to God, I have no idea how this happened. It's the craziest thing that's ever happened in my career.
What's the status of the production?
They're starting to film, and they did the pilot already, and they're starting to film multiple episodes in a couple of days, actually. And it's fully cast, and it's unbelievable.
A lot of times we look at a sports movie, we think it's a sports movie, but it's about relationships. And I don't know if it's different in a series because how much of this is about actual basketball or the relationships within the basketball team or, Jerry Buss or Pat Riley. So can you give us a sense of what you think the direction is of Showtime?
Well, I think they're very hyper into the sort of development of the dynasty, at least at this point, and sort of not just Jerry Buss, but how he became Jerry Buss. And, the blooming of Magic Johnson. One thing they've done that I think is really cool is if you look at the cast, they've combined a lot of really established actors playing these big roles. Adrian Brody, Sally Field, just different. And then like the guy playing Magic, who's awesome, is this guy named Quincy Isaiah. He's just a young sort of unknown actor. And it just seems like they're really emphasize the blooming of relationships and the development of these characters. It's not just going to be a stupid, look at them play basketball. We're just going to throw a bunch of balls out there and have actors play basketball really poorly. I think it's going to be more about the development of the characters, which is what you try to do in a book.
How do you cast Kareem Abdul-Jabbar?
You get someone very tall. The guy playing him played basketball at Cal. So they casted very tall. I mean, it's interesting because I've learned a lot about sort of what goes into it and how it's not just about height. Like you don't just want a 7'2" guy if all the other actors are 5'11". So everything is in ratio and everything is relative. I actually learned a lot just from observing and sort of being kept in the loop about everything and how it goes down.
What's the one thing that you took away from your book that you didn't know? Like it became a lot larger or it stayed quieter than you thought it was going to?
I actually, at the time, I was unaware of the sort of demons of Jerry West. I always thought growing up and then watching basketball that Jerry West was just calm, cool, collected. And then you really get to know him and learn about him. And he's a really tortured individual. It's kind of what makes him great, but the everything he's gone through in his boyhood, sort of abuse, he reminds me a lot of Billy Beane. You've probably experienced a lot of Billy Beane, where he can't watch a game.
Yeah.
I remember covering the A's and Billy Beane could not watch a game. And Jerry West is basically Billy Beane. I always found that torture really interesting.
Yeah, he's brought that up a couple times that, he had a shotgun under his mattress and he was going to kill his dad who was abusing his mom. And he said he used to drive around, like he couldn't even be in the building sometimes with the Lakers with these big games, that he would drive around and then wait till the game was over.
One thing that's interesting, you mentioned in the intro of Norm Nixon and Magic Johnson, the trading of Norm Nixon. And Magic Johnson was thrilled when Norm Nixon was traded. He was not upset. There was a real conflict between those two. Norm Nixon had been the established point guard and really viewed it as his team. And then Magic comes along and they kind of hand it to him and it's his team. And there was no way it was going to work having those two point guards. It's not like they hated each other, but it was not a very good on-court basketball relationship.
How tough was Riley on these players?
I mean, it's interesting. He came in, and when he arrived, he was a completely inexperienced, been a radio guy, had been with Chick Hearn, and then he's an assistant under Westhead, and suddenly he's a head coach, and everyone's like, oh, it's Pat Riley, laid back Pat Riley. And over the years, he developed this term called peripheral distractions. That was his thing. We can't have any peripheral distractions, and peripheral distractions meant the media, it meant wives, it meant girlfriends, it meant anything that took away from the team at all. And he became sort of hyper intense about it. And by the time he was done, by the time his run ended, the Laker players wanted nothing to do with him because he was just had gone way over the top.
But I remember when Wright Thompson did a profile on Pat Riley, and then you got an idea, because when Wright does a deep dive, you're going to find out about that person, and you realize that's Pat Riley. Perfectionist, never happy. What he grew up with his father, and I would hear stories, but I was never close enough that they kind of tolerated him. At the end, they sort of just tolerated Riles, but he had definitely worn out his welcome. What's part of the book that you might be not nervous about, but maybe how do you capture this in the true sense of what it really was in the book?
So there's my favorite moment of all the stuff I wrote about for that book is Magic Johnson's arrival in Los Angeles. And there's this moment that I just love. He comes to LA for the first time to negotiate with the Lakers, and he's being driven in a limo down some street, and he sees oranges growing on a tree, and he tells the guy to stop the car, and he gets out and he picks an orange because he's just blown away by this idea that I'm in this land where fruit is growing on a tree. And I just think the essence of that team and that era and everything about in that book can be summed up in Magic Johnson picking an orange from a tree. And just, I don't know how, I'm not saying you can't do it, how you capture the sort of late 70s, early 80s guy who's never been to California, his life about to change forever, all embodied by the beauty of an orange on a tree and just being dazzled by that fruit sitting there. I love that. I don't know how you capture that, but I just think it's the most beautiful thing.
Was there one move that almost didn't happen or the other way? Like they made a move and it benefited them?
Well, the trade that almost happened, that almost ended the Jerry West marriage was they almost traded James Worthy to Dallas for Mark Aguirre. And Jerry Buss agreed to the deal with Don Carter, the Mavs owner, behind Jerry West's back, and goes and says to Jerry West, oh, we have this deal worked out. And on paper, that's a very, very fantasy basketball kind of trade. We're like, this is amazing. Mark Aguirre averages 25 a game. And then you're stuck with Mark Aguirre, and Jerry West said, if you make this trade, I'm done here. So that trade, I think, almost ruined everything.
Did they almost not get Magic or pass on Magic?
Well, they the first choice of Jerry West, he's loath to talk about this, was Sidney Moncrief out of Arkansas. It's actually an interesting thing, though. I always say this.
I mean, a Hall of Famer.
If their backcourt is Sidney Moncrief, Norm Nixon with Kareem at center, Jamal Wilkes at one, that's not a bad team.
Yeah,
it's not the Showtime Lakers, but they're certainly in the topic of a championship. But Moncrief did not have the charisma and the spark one that razzle-dazzled with Magic Johnson. But it was definitely considered strongly.
But also the style that they played, Jeff, that it was Showtime. Was Riley a fan of Showtime?
Yeah, well, the thing that's interesting is their first coach was a guy named Jack McKinney. He was a coach. People forget about this. The first coach, actually, Jerry Tarkanian was supposed to be the coach. And Jerry Buss hired Jerry Tarkanian. They agreed to it. And then Jerry Tarkanian's agent turned up dead in the trunk of a car. And that Tarkanian decided not to take the job. True story. Then they hired Jack McKinney.
Wait, is there a backstory on that, Jeff? That sounds like a movie.
Yeah, well, there were a lot of mafioso ties, and I forgot exactly what the agent had done, but he crossed some line you weren't supposed to cross, and they ended up being killed. And this was a close friend of Tarkanian, and Tarkanian decided he couldn't take the job. There's too much going on, blah, 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 blah. But then they hired Jack McKinney, who had been a longtime St. Joe's assistant, head coach, Jack Ramsey's assistant in Portland. He's the head coach and everything's going great. And he puts in this system that became known as Showtime. And I think it was 14 games or 11 games into his first season. It's a day off. He has one assistant coach in the quaint days of the NBA, Paul Westhead. They're going to play tennis. Jack McKinney is riding his bike to meet Paul Westhead, falls head over heels, lands on his head. It's amazing how this was so quaint of the days of the NBA. He was a John Doe in the hospital. The head coach of the Lakers was a John Doe in the hospital, has suffered severe brain trauma. Paul Westhead takes over, runs Jack McKinney's system, leads the Lakers to the championship. McKinney is never brought back. Westhead wears out his welcome quick, and Riley comes in. So Riley just kind of resumed the system called, I mean, they start calling it Showtime, but it really was Jack McKinney's system.
Is it 1 year? I mean, it's one season, I should say, as far as HBO. Is that the commitment right now?
Yeah, I think so. But I think the plan is to do more than one.
Okay.
So, yeah, I don't know contractually what it is right now, but I think the plan is to do more than one.
You get a cameo?
I did get a cameo.
Do you play yourself in the series?
Well, I would have only been like 6 years old at the time, but I do play. They let I played a reporter. My wife, Catherine, was Rod Thorne's executive assistant during the draft, and my kids played extras during a scene in a Hollywood set. So it's been really cool. It's been great.
I was also wondering, we brought this up, like if you were looking at like Kobe and Shaq, that feels like that would be an interesting series. I don't know if you, right?
I mean, I wrote a book on the air. If they I welcome them to option that book.
Three Ring Circus. Yeah.
I have no problem with that.
Yeah.
I agree with you. 100%.
Sure. Why not? I was wondering, is there another, let's say you could pick any other basketball. McLovin, do you have a couple?
Oh, I was saying, the LeBron Heat team, or maybe the Kevin Durant and the Warriors recently, like a Moneyball version of the Warriors.
I don't know if there's any real drama there.
LeBron going back to the Cavs.
I mean, I heard you guys talking about it. I wrote a book. My first book was about the '86 Mets, and that book has been optioned about 73,000 times. And the Mets have always just been a pain in the butt about it. I'm hoping new ownership, maybe, but I think the '86 Mets are a great story.
I don't know if we ever crossed paths, but I was working at CNN and covering the Mets back then. And I like, there's stories I can't tell, but I mean, it was crazy.
Yeah, it's the best.
One time I was in Chicago, I can tell this, and this isn't bad, but I see Lenny Dykstra at the China Club, and Lenny has a dip, he's got a cigarette, and he's got a drink. And he had like all the vices I knew of back then, but he had it all going on. And I just remember whenever you were around these people, they were big person. Even Gary Carter, kid was straight as can be, but he was a big personality. Then you had Gooden, who was private. Strawberry, you never quite sure. Keith Hernandez, I was never quite sure. Roger McDowell, Danny Heap, Jesse, like there are all these personalities here. How did you kind of keep track of, who to go to and who not to go to?
I just want to say, I just said to someone the other day, and I bet you'd agree with this. If you had said to someone in 1986, which of these players is going to pass first, Gary Carter would have been the last guy on that list.
Yeah.
It just would have been the last guy. He was a straight living, clean, blah, 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 blah. My favorite Dykstra is they were at a golf club one time, and there were a bunch of priests in the golf club. I don't know why, playing golf or whatever, and in the clubhouse. And Lenny Dykstra goes to a friend, watch this. And he walks up to the priest, lifts a leg, and just drops a huge fart in front of the priest. Like, he was the most vile, but entertaining. He'd be a great character in a movie.
Oh.
I think that team was just stuffed with characters, as you noted.
But you had 86 Mets, 86 New York Giants, and they only won one. And I kept thinking both of those underachieved with the talent that they had. But if you had LT with Parcells and the Giants, that might have been an interesting one as well. So you got,
I agree.
Yeah. Well, good luck with this, Jeff. Congrats. It's a great book. It's Showtime Magic, Kareem Riley, and the LA Laker dynasty of the 1980s. And now it's been greenlit by HBO. Thank you, Jeff.
All right. Thanks, Dan.
All right.